The morning of March 21st, 1943, over the coastal lowlands of occupied Holland, Oberleutnant Klaus Mertens banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109 through broken cloud cover at 8,000 feet. Below him, the flat patchwork of reclaimed land and canal systems stretched toward the North Sea. His wingman, flying tight formation off his starboard quarter, called out the sighting first. Bomber formation, 11 o'clock low. Americans. Mertens spotted them immediately. 6 aircraft in loose tactical formation, perhaps 3,000 feet below, heading southeast toward the industrial targets near Rotterdam. He recognized the silhouette instantly. Douglas A-20 Havocs. The Americans called them Havocs. The British, who flew them first, knew them as Bostons. To Luftwaffe pilots stationed along the western approaches, they were Glasnasen, glass noses, a dismissive reference to the transparent bombardier station that characterized the standard light bomber variant. Mertens felt no particular concern. The A-20 represented a secondary threat at best. It carried a modest bomb load compared to the heavy bombers that had been hammering German industrial centers with increasing frequency. Its defensive armament, according to intelligence briefings he had attended at Schiphol Air Base, consisted of dorsal and ventral gun positions, firing standard American .50 caliber machine guns. Respectable defensive weapons, certainly, but nothing that would deter a properly executed fighter attack from the forward quarter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical situation appeared textbook simple. Mertens had altitude advantage, surprise, and clear weather conditions. The bomber formation showed no sign of fighter escort. Standard doctrine called for a diving attack from the forward quarter, where the bomber's defensive fire remained weakest, concentrating on the lead aircraft to disrupt formation cohesion before the remaining bombers could maneuver effectively. He armed his weapons, 2 13mm MG 131 machine guns mounted above the engine cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, 1 20mm MG 151 motor cannon firing through the propeller hub, sufficient firepower to tear through the relatively light construction of a twin-engine bomber at close range. Mertens pushed his control stick forward, beginning his diving attack run. His airspeed built rapidly as gravity and engine power combined. 400 km per hour, 450. The bombers grew larger in his gun sight, their twin radial engines clearly visible now, their glazed nose sections catching the morning sunlight. What happened in the next 7 seconds would fundamentally alter Klaus Mertens' understanding of American tactical aviation doctrine. It would force a complete reassessment of intelligence estimates that had categorized the A-20 as a light bomber suitable primarily for tactical harassment missions against secondary targets. And it would introduce German fighter pilots along the Western Front to a brutal new reality about concentrated forward-firing armament that their training and experience had not prepared them to counter. The lead A-20 did not attempt evasive maneuvers. It did not break formation. The glazed nose section that Mertens had identified as a bombardier station erupted with muzzle flashes, not the intermittent fire of a single defensive gun position, but a sustained, overwhelming torrent of tracer rounds that seemed to fill the entire airspace between the two aircraft. 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in a solid nose installation where the bombardier station should have been, firing forward in perfect convergence at a combined rate of 3,600 rounds per minute. Mertens never completed his attack run. The Douglas A-20 Havoc began its operational life in 1938 as a private venture by the Douglas Aircraft Company, designed to meet anticipated military requirements for a fast, maneuverable attack bomber. Chief designer Ed Heinemann and his team created an aircraft that emphasized speed and handling characteristics over heavy bomb load or extensive defensive armament. The original concept envisioned a light bomber that could penetrate enemy airspace through speed and agility, rather than relying on heavy defensive guns or fighter escort. The design featured 2 Wright R2600 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower at takeoff power settings. These powerful engines gave the A-20 a maximum speed approaching 350 miles per hour at medium altitude, making it one of the fastest operational bombers in service when it entered production. The tricycle landing gear configuration, still relatively uncommon in 1940, provided excellent ground handling characteristics and improved pilot visibility during taxiing and landing operations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The original A-20 variants carried their bomb load internally in a fuselage bay capable of accommodating 2,000 pounds of ordnance. A crew of 3 operated the aircraft: pilot, bombardier navigator stationed in the glazed nose section, and rear gunner manning twin 50 caliber guns in a dorsal turret. A ventral gun position, typically mounting a single 50 caliber weapon firing rearward and downward, provided limited defense against attacks from below. This configuration reflected conventional light bomber doctrine of the period, which assumed that defensive armament and formation tactics would provide adequate protection against fighter interception. The British Royal Air Force became the first operational user of the type, ordering significant quantities under the designation Boston Mark I in 1940. British squadrons employed the aircraft primarily in daylight tactical bombing missions against targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. Early operational reports praised the A-20's speed and handling qualities, while noting the modest bomb load and the challenges of operating such a fast aircraft in the precise formation flying required for effective bombing. The runs. French Air Force units received A-20 deliveries before the fall of France in June 1940, though few became operational before the armistice. Following France's defeat, some of these aircraft reached Britain, where they supplemented RAF Boston squadrons already forming. Soviet forces received substantial numbers through Lend-Lease arrangements, eventually operating more A-20s than any other air force. Soviet pilots appreciated the aircraft's ruggedness and relatively simple maintenance requirements, critical factors given the austere operating conditions on the Eastern Front. American entry into the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought U.S. Army Air Force's units into combat with A-20s in multiple theaters. The 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, the 9th Air Force in North Africa and later Europe, and the 12th Air Force in the Mediterranean all operated A-20 squadrons in tactical roles. Initial combat experience confirmed the aircraft's speed and maneuverability, while revealing vulnerabilities that would drive significant modifications to later variants. German intelligence assessments during 1942 characterized the A-20 as a competent light bomber with performance comparable to the Junkers Ju-88, though carrying a lighter bomb load. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine for engaging A-20s emphasized forward quarter attacks, exploiting the limited forward-firing defensive armament common to conventional bomber designs. The glazed nose section, clearly visible in recognition training materials distributed to fighter units, identified the bombardier station as the location of the aircraft's most vulnerable crew position and its least defended approach vector. This assessment, thoroughly documented in Luftwaffe intelligence summaries and training materials from the period, would prove catastrophically incorrect once modified A-20 variants began appearing over occupied Europe in early 1943. The transformation of the Douglas A-20 from conventional light bomber to devastating low-altitude attack aircraft began not in engineering offices or formal military planning sessions, but in the improvised modifications undertaken by operational squadrons facing specific tactical challenges in the Southwest Pacific Theater. 5th Air Force units, operating under the command of Major General George Kenney, confronted a fundamental problem. Japanese shipping supplying forward bases throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands required destruction, but conventional horizontal bombing from medium altitude proved ineffective against maneuvering vessels at sea. Captain Paul Pappy Gunn, a former naval aviator serving with the 5th Air Force, recognized that the solution required transforming bombers into low-altitude strafers capable of sustained forward fire. Working with depot maintenance crews at Townsville, Australia, in late 1942, Gunn oversaw the installation of 4 additional 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the solid nose section of several A-20 aircraft. This modification required removing the bombardier position entirely, replacing the glazed nose section with a solid metal structure that could accommodate the weapons and their ammunition feed systems. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The initial field modifications proved their tactical value almost immediately. A-20s equipped with forward-firing guns devastated Japanese coastal vessels, supply barges, and ground installations during low-altitude strafing runs. The concentrated fire from multiple 50-caliber weapons, all firing forward in convergence, created a beaten zone of devastating effect against unarmored or lightly armored targets. Ships caught in the open, unable to maneuver quickly enough to evade low-altitude attack runs, suffered catastrophic damage from sustained bursts that could last several seconds as the attacking aircraft closed range. Douglas Aircraft Company, recognizing the tactical potential demonstrated by these field modifications, formalized the design in factory-produced variants. The A-20G model, which entered production in early 1943, featured a solid nose installation mounting 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns as standard equipment. The weapons were arranged in 2 rows, 4 guns in the lower position, 2 guns in the upper position, all firing forward with convergence patterns optimized for engagement ranges between 300 and 600 yards. Each 50-caliber Browning M2 machine gun carried approximately 350 rounds of linked ammunition, stored in ammunition boxes mounted within the fuselage and fed to the guns through flexible chutes. The total ammunition load for the 6-gun installation exceeded 2,000 rounds, sufficient for approximately 30 seconds of sustained firing at the weapon's cyclic rate of 600 rounds per minute per gun. In practice, pilots typically fired in shorter bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating, but the available firepower represented an overwhelming concentration of offensive capability. The ballistic characteristics of the 50-caliber round made it particularly effective against aircraft, structures, light armor, and personnel. The standard M2 ball cartridge fired a 709-grain projectile at a muzzle velocity of 2,840 feet per second, delivering 2,900 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. At typical combat ranges of 400 yards, the round retained sufficient energy to penetrate aluminum aircraft skin, destroy engines and fuel systems, and cause catastrophic structural failures in airframes not designed to withstand such concentrated fire. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds, typically mixed with ball and tracer ammunition in standardized belt loadings, enhanced effectiveness against hardened targets. The incendiary component, designed to ignite fuel and hydraulic systems, proved particularly devastating against aircraft, where any penetration that reached fuel tanks or hydraulic lines could result in catastrophic fires that spread rapidly through the airframe. Tracer rounds, loaded at intervals to provide visual indication of bullet trajectory, allowed pilots to observe their fire and adjust aim in real time, though the smoke trail they produced could also reveal the attacker's position. The psychological impact of concentrated 50-caliber fire proved as significant as its physical destructive capability. German pilots, accustomed to the relatively light defensive fire from conventional bomber nose gun positions, encountered something fundamentally different when facing A-20G variants. The sheer volume of fire, the visible stream of tracers converging on their aircraft, and the devastating effect of multiple heavy machine guns hitting simultaneously created an overwhelming sensory experience that challenged the tactical assumptions underlying Luftwaffe fighter doctrine. The A-20G variant that entered operational service with the 9th Air Force in Europe during spring 1943 represented the culmination of lessons learned from Southwest Pacific combat operations. The aircraft that arrived at tactical bombardment groups stationed in England bore little resemblance to the conventional light bomber that had first entered service 3 years earlier. Douglas Aircraft Company's production line at Santa Monica, California, delivered A-20Gs with the solid nose installation as standard configuration, eliminating the glazed bombardier station entirely in favor of offensive firepower. The 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in the nose section, occupied precise positions within a reinforced metal structure designed to absorb recoil forces and maintain weapon alignment during sustained firing. The 4 lower guns were positioned in a rectangular pattern, spaced to allow ammunition feed mechanisms and to prevent interference between adjacent weapons. The 2 upper guns sat slightly higher and further back, creating a staggered arrangement that maximized the available space within the confined nose section while maintaining parallel firing trajectories. Armament specialists at 9th Air Force bases in England discovered that proper harmonization of the 6-gun installation required meticulous attention to detail. Each weapon needed individual adjustment to ensure that all 6 firing trajectories converged at the optimal combat range. The standard harmonization procedure called for convergence at 400 yards, though some units experimented with closer convergence points of 300 yards for attacks against ground targets where engagement ranges tended to be shorter. The process involved mounting the aircraft on jacks to establish precise level flight attitude, then firing test bursts at patterns painted on targets positioned at the specified convergence distance. When properly harmonized, the 6 weapons created a beaten zone, approximately 6 feet in diameter at 400 yards range. Every round passing through this circular area during a sustained burst created a probability of multiple hits on any passes, target occupying that space. Against an aircraft fuselage, typically 8 to 10 feet wide at its maximum diameter, this meant that a significant percentage of rounds fired would find the target once the pilot established proper aim and maintained tracking during the firing pass. The hydraulic charging system that cocked the weapons before firing represented a significant engineering achievement that simplified pilot workload during combat operations. Earlier installations had required manual charging of each weapon individually, a time-consuming process that ground crews performed before takeoff. The hydraulic system allowed the pilot to charge all 6 weapons simultaneously, using a cockpit-mounted switch that activated hydraulic actuators connected to each gun's charging mechanism. This capability meant that if a weapon experienced a malfunction and stopped firing, the pilot could attempt to clear the stoppage and recharge the gun without landing, potentially restoring full firepower during the same mission. Ammunition supply logistics posed substantial challenges for units operating A-20G variants. Each aircraft consumed 50 caliber ammunition at prodigious rates during combat missions. A typical strafing attack lasting 3 to 4 seconds expended approximately 300 to 400 rounds of combined fire from all 6 guns. Multiple strafing passes during a single mission could exhaust the entire ammunition load of over 2,000 rounds. 5th Air Force units in the Pacific Theater reported instances where aggressive pilots returned from missions with completely empty ammunition bays, having fired every available round during sustained attacks against Japanese positions. The 9th Air Force in Europe, supporting the Allied advance following the Normandy invasion in June 1944, maintained forward ammunition supply points at airfields throughout liberated France. Armament crews worked continuously to reload returning aircraft, often completing the rearming process in less than an hour to maximize aircraft availability for subsequent missions. Each 50 caliber round weighed approximately 4 ounces when loaded in linked belts, meaning that the complete ammunition load for one A-20G exceeded 500 pounds, not including the weight of the ammunition boxes and feed mechanisms. The 341st Bombardment Group, stationed at Matching Green Airfield in Essex, England, transitioned to A-20G variants in March 1943. The group's 4 squadrons, the 22nd, 409th, 410th, and 411th Bombardment Squadrons, began flying combat missions against targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. Initial operations focused on attacking German airfields, rail yards, and coastal installations, missions that placed A-20 formations in direct contact with Luftwaffe fighter units defending occupied territories. Luftwaffe fighter units based at Schiphol, Deelen, and Gilze Regen airfields in Holland maintained regular combat air patrols along coastal approaches. These units, primarily equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 109G variants and Fokker-Wulf Fo 190A models, received intelligence briefings describing American A-20 formations as light bombers carrying modest defensive armament. Standard tactical doctrine emphasized forward quarter attacks, exploiting what intelligence summaries identified as weak forward defensive fire from the bombardier position. The morning mission brief at Schiphol Airfield on March 21, 1943, followed standard procedures that had been refined through 2 years of combat operations against British and American aircraft. Oberleutnant Klaus Mertens attended the briefing with 11 other pilots from his staffel, listening as the intelligence officer reviewed expected enemy activity along the coastal sectors. American bomber formations had been increasing their penetration missions into Dutch airspace, targeting transportation infrastructure and military installations. A-20 formations represented frequent visitors, easily identified by their twin-engine configuration and distinctive nose glazing. The tactical guidance remained unchanged from previous briefings. Approach from forward quarter to minimize exposure to defensive fire. Target the lead aircraft to disrupt formation cohesion. Execute diving attacks from altitude advantage to maximize closing speed and minimize time exposed to defensive weapons. Standard fighter versus bomber tactics that had proven effective against numerous Allied bomber types throughout the European theater. Mertens launched at 09:15 hours local time, leading a swarm of 4 aircraft tasked with coastal patrol between Rotterdam and The Hague. Weather conditions favored visual flight operations. Scattered clouds at 7,000 feet, visibility exceeding 10 kilometers, light winds from the northwest. Ideal conditions for intercepting enemy bomber formations approaching from the North Sea. The contact report came 37 minutes into the patrol. Ground controllers vectored Mertens' formation toward an inbound bomber group detected by coastal radar stations. 6 contacts, medium altitude, heading southeast toward Rotterdam. The tactical situation appeared routine. Mertens positioned his formation for an intercept, climbing to 8,000 feet to establish altitude advantage before commencing the attack run. Visual contact occurred at 09:53 hours. The bomber formation maintained loose tactical spacing approximately 1,000 meters apart laterally, flying straight and level toward their target. Mertens identified the aircraft type immediately through the distinctive twin radial engine configuration and overall silhouette. A-20s. Glasnasen. Light bombers carrying perhaps 2,000 pounds of ordnance total between all 6 aircraft. No fighter escort visible despite excellent visibility conditions. Mertens armed his weapons and signaled his attack intention to his wingmen. Standard forward quarter diving attack, close to 400 meters before opening fire to ensure maximum hit probability. Concentrate fire on the lead aircraft. The tactical geometry appeared textbook perfect. Mertens pushed his control stick forward, rolling into the diving attack run at 09:54 hours. His airspeed built rapidly as altitude converted to velocity. The bomber formation grew larger in his reflector gun sight, the individual aircraft details becoming distinct. He could see the nose sections clearly now, transparent glazing catching sunlight reflections. The bombardier stations, where the crews would be preparing their bomb runs, where the weakest defensive armament would be positioned, where his attack would prove most effective. At 600 meters range, the lead A-20's nose erupted with muzzle flashes, not the intermittent fire pattern of a single defensive gun position, a sustained, concentrated torrent that created a visible stream of tracers converging directly toward his aircraft. Mertens registered the sight with momentary incomprehension. 6 distinct firing points, all positioned in what should have been the bombardier station. 6 heavy machine guns firing forward in perfect synchronization. The closing rate between the 2 aircraft exceeded 650 kilometers per hour combined. At that velocity, 600 meters separation closed to weapon-effective range in approximately 3 seconds. The A-20's guns fired continuously throughout those 3 seconds, each gun cycling at 600 rounds per minute, each gun sending approximately 30 rounds downrange before Mertens could react. 180 rounds total, concentrated in a beaten zone directly in his flight path. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first hits struck Mertens' aircraft at 520 meters range. 50 caliber rounds penetrated the thin aluminum skin of the Bf-109's nose section, tearing through the engine cowling and into the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine. Multiple rounds struck the propeller blades, creating catastrophic imbalance that generated violent vibrations throughout the airframe. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds that hit the engine ignited glycol coolant lines, sending white vapor streaming from punctured cooling systems. Mertens broke off the attack immediately, rolling hard left and pulling into a climbing turn to escape the concentrated fire. His engine temperature gauge climbed rapidly as coolant pressure dropped to zero. White vapor obscured his forward visibility. The propeller vibration intensified, threatening structural failure of the engine mounts. Within 15 seconds of breaking off the attack, his engine seized completely, the propeller windmilling uselessly as internal components welded themselves together from excessive heat. He transmitted his situation to the formation leader, declared an emergency, and began immediate preparations for forced landing. His altitude of 7,000 feet provided sufficient margin to glide toward Schiphol Airfield, approximately 40 kilometers distant. The Bf-109's glide characteristics, though not exceptional, allowed controlled descent toward the airfield with careful energy management. Mertens landed on Schiphol's main runway at 10:06 hours, his aircraft trailing white vapor from the destroyed cooling system. Ground crews counted 37 separate impact points on the forward fuselage and engine cowling. The engine itself required complete replacement. The propeller needed replacement. Multiple airframe components showed structural damage requiring depot-level repair. The aircraft remained non-operational for 6 weeks, while mechanics sourced replacement parts and completed necessary repairs. The combat encounter report that Oberleutnant Klaus Mertens submitted to his Staffel commander on the afternoon of March 21, 1943, contradicted existing intelligence assessments about A-20 defensive capabilities. Mertens described 6 forward-firing heavy machine guns mounted in the bomber's nose section, creating concentrated fire that made forward-quarter attacks suicidal at typical engagement ranges. His wingman, who had aborted his own attack, run after observing what happened to Mertens' aircraft, corroborated the report with his own observations of the devastating fire concentration. The Staffel intelligence officer initially questioned the accuracy of these reports. Existing intelligence summaries clearly identified A-20s as conventional light bombers, with glazed nose sections housing bombardier stations. Forward defensive armament, according to documented assessments, consisted of single, flexible gun positions with limited fields of fire. The concept of 6 fixed forward-firing guns in the nose contradicted fundamental assumptions about bomber design doctrine. Within 72 hours, 3 additional Luftwaffe pilots from units stationed in Holland reported similar encounters with heavily armed A-20 variants. One Focke-Wulf 4-190 pilot described approaching what he assumed was a standard A-20 formation only to encounter what he characterized as a wall of tracers that forced immediate evasion. Another pilot reported that his wingman's aircraft had been shot down during a forward quarter attack, destroyed by concentrated fire before he could break off his attack run. The wingman did not survive. Intelligence staffs at Luftwaffe, 3 headquarters in Paris, began compiling these combat reports and cross-referencing them with captured documents and interrogation reports from Allied aircrew prisoners. Confirmation arrived through multiple sources that American tactical doctrine had indeed evolved to emphasize offensive armament in light bomber variants intended for low-altitude attack missions. The A-20G variant represented a fundamental departure from conventional bomber design philosophy, sacrificing the bombardier position and precision bombing capability in favor of devastating forward firepower optimized for strafing attacks. Revised tactical guidance distributed to fighter units throughout Holland and northern France in April 1943 explicitly warned against forward quarter attacks on A-20 formations. The new doctrine emphasized attacks from the rear hemisphere, where conventional defensive turret armament remained relatively modest. Pilots received instructions to visually identify A-20 nose configurations before committing to attack runs, distinguishing between glazed bombardier stations and solid nose installations that indicated the heavily armed G variant. These tactical modifications reduced Luftwaffe fighter losses during encounters with A-20 formations, though the revised doctrine presented its own challenges. Rear hemisphere attacks required fighters to approach from behind, matching the bomber's speed while maneuvering into firing position. This approach exposed attacking fighters to defensive fire from dorsal turrets for extended periods. increased vulnerability to escort fighters that typically positioned themselves to protect bomber formations from exactly such attacks, and reduced the closing speed advantage that diving attacks provided. The broader implications of the A-20's transformation from conventional bomber to dedicated attack aircraft extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. American willingness to fundamentally redesign operational aircraft based on combat experience demonstrated institutional flexibility that contrasted with more rigid German military procurement processes. The speed with which field modifications in the Southwest Pacific influenced factory production standards illustrated industrial responsiveness that could rapidly translate tactical innovations into widespread operational capability. 9th Air Force A-20 groups in England expanded their operations throughout spring and summer 1943, conducting increasingly aggressive attacks against German installations throughout occupied France and the Low Countries. The 341st Bombardment Group alone flew over 200 combat missions between March and September, destroying numerous locomotives, rail cars, vehicles, coastal installations, and parked aircraft. Loss rates, while significant, remained within acceptable operational parameters, given the intensity of combat operations and the heavily defended nature of many targets. German defensive measures evolved in response to the A-20 threat. Anti-aircraft artillery units received instructions to prioritize low-altitude strafers, recognizing that these aircraft posed immediate tactical threats to ground installations and transportation infrastructure. Fighter units developed tactics specifically designed to counter low-altitude attack aircraft, including positioning combat air patrols at altitudes that allowed rapid descent to intercept strafers approaching targets. Early warning radar networks extended coverage to detect low-altitude intrusions that earlier systems had missed. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots who encountered A-20G variants proved as significant as the tactical implications. The experience of approaching what appeared to be a vulnerable bomber only to face overwhelming forward fire challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat dynamics. German fighter pilots had been trained to exploit bomber vulnerabilities through aggressive attacks that pressed home despite defensive fire. The A-20G's concentrated offensive armament created situations where pressing home an attack from the forward quarter meant almost certain destruction, forcing pilots to break off attacks that under different circumstances might have succeeded. The A-20's transformation from conventional light bomber to dedicated attack aircraft reflected broader evolution in tactical aviation doctrine that occurred across multiple theaters during World War II. The Pacific Theater, where the gunship concept originated, continued driving modifications that pushed offensive capabilities even further. 5th Air Force units operating in New Guinea and the Philippines received A-20 variants mounting 850 caliber guns in the nose section, adding 2 additional weapons to the already formidable 6-gun installation. Some field modifications incorporated additional gun packages in ventral positions, creating total forward-firing armament exceeding 10 heavy machine guns. These heavily armed variants proved devastating against Japanese shipping, coastal installations, and airfields. Mission reports from 5th Air Force operations in 1944 document attacks that destroyed entire convoys of supply barges, devastated airfield infrastructure, and suppressed defensive positions during amphibious landings. The concentrated firepower allowed single aircraft to achieve destructive effects that previously required multiple bombers delivering conventional ordnance. The psychological impact on Japanese ground forces subjected to sustained strafing attacks contributed to defensive positions becoming untenable even before ground assault forces arrived. European theatre operations followed similar trajectories. Once the Normandy invasion in June 1944 created opportunities for sustained tactical air operations in direct support of ground forces. 9th Air Force A-20 groups moved to forward airfields in France, operating from hastily prepared strips that allowed rapid response to ground commander requests for close air support. The aircraft's combination of speed, maneuverability, and concentrated firepower made it particularly effective against transportation targets, troop concentrations, and fortified positions that resisted conventional bombing. The 341st Bombardment Group, which had encountered skeptical Luftwaffe opposition during early 1943 missions over Holland, operated from airfields at Cormeilles-en-Vexin and later Saint-Dizier in eastern France during the autumn advance toward Germany. Mission logs from this period document sustained operations against retreating German columns, rail transportation networks, and defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. Loss rates increased as German anti-aircraft defenses concentrated along frontier approaches, but the group maintained operational effectiveness through the final months of 1944. Maintenance requirements for A-20G variants created substantial logistical challenges that tested 9th Air Force supply systems. The 650 caliber guns required regular maintenance to prevent malfunctions that could occur after sustained firing. Barrel replacement became necessary after approximately 10,000 rounds fired per gun, a threshold that frontline aircraft reached within weeks of intensive operations. Hydraulic systems that charged the weapons and operated turrets required constant attention to maintain reliability. Engines accumulated flight hours rapidly given the intensive operational tempo, necessitating scheduled overhauls that temporarily removed aircraft from combat status. Ground crews working at forward airfields often operated under austere conditions that complicated maintenance operations. Parts supply chains stretched across hundreds of kilometers from depots in England to forward operating locations in France. Weather conditions during autumn and winter months created additional challenges, with mud, rain, and cold temperatures affecting both aircraft, serviceability, and crew working conditions. Despite these difficulties, 9th Air Force maintenance units achieved remarkable aircraft availability rates that sustained continuous combat operations. The broader strategic impact of tactical attack aircraft like the A-20 extended beyond immediate battlefield effects. German transportation networks, already strained by strategic bombing of industrial centers and rail yards, faced additional pressure from tactical aircraft that could strike moving targets and temporary concentrations that strategic bombers could not effectively engage. The cumulative effect of sustained tactical air operations interdicted German supply lines, complicated troop movements, and forced defensive dispositions that diverted resources from frontline combat operations. Luftwaffe responses to the tactical air threat illustrated the cascading effects of Allied air superiority. Fighter units that might have opposed strategic bombing raids instead found themselves committed to defending ground installations and transportation networks from low-altitude attack aircraft. Anti-aircraft artillery units proliferated throughout rear areas, diverting weapons and personnel from frontline employment. The psychological burden on German ground forces, subjected to continuous air attack with minimal friendly air protection, contributed to deteriorating morale and combat effectiveness during the final year of the war in Europe. Soviet air forces, which received substantial numbers of A-20 variants through Lend-Lease deliveries, employed the aircraft extensively on the Eastern Front. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized ground attack operations, making the A-20's capabilities particularly relevant to operational requirements. Soviet units reportedly appreciated the aircraft's ruggedness and ability to sustain battle damage while remaining flyable, critical characteristics given the intense anti-aircraft fire that characterized Eastern Front operations. Individual aircrew experiences flying A-20 combat missions revealed the human dimension of tactical air warfare that statistical summaries and operational reports inadequately captured. First Lieutenant James Morrison, a pilot with the 410th Bombardment Squadron of the 341st Bombardment Group, flew 63 combat missions in A-20G aircraft between April 1943 and February 1944. His personal diary, preserved in family archives and later donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, provides detailed accounts of low-altitude attack missions that illustrated both the effectiveness and dangers of the gunship role. Morrison described the sensory experience of strafing attacks with clinical precision, the sustained vibration that shook the entire aircraft when all 6 nose guns fired simultaneously, the acrid smell of gun smoke that filled the cockpit despite ventilation systems, the visible stream of tracers arcing toward targets, allowing real-time observation of impact effects, the brief moments of satisfaction when ammunition struck, fuel storage tanks or parked aircraft and secondary explosions confirmed successful hits. The equally frequent frustration when targets proved more resilient than expected, absorbing substantial fire without visible damage. The psychological burden of low-altitude operations appeared repeatedly in Morrison's accounts. Flying at 500 feet or lower placed aircraft within effective range of small arms fire, light anti-aircraft weapons, and even determined rifle fire from ground troops. Every mission meant exposure to defensive fire from positions that could appear suddenly with minimal warning. Unlike high-altitude bombing operations, where anti-aircraft fire remained relatively impersonal and distant, low-altitude missions created intimate confrontations where aircrew could see individual defenders manning weapons positions. Observe the muzzle flashes of guns firing at their aircraft and sometimes make eye contact with ground personnel moments before weapons opened fire. Morrison's squadron lost 9 aircraft to various causes during the 11-month period he flew combat operations. 3 aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft fire during low-altitude attacks, 2 collided during formation maneuvering in poor weather conditions. 1 suffered catastrophic mechanical failure that forced the crew to bail out over friendly territory. 2 were destroyed on the ground during German air raids against Allied airfields. 1 disappeared over the English Channel during a return flight from France, cause unknown. Crew never recovered. These losses represented approximately 30% of the squadron's authorized aircraft strength, though replacement aircraft and crews maintained operational capability throughout the period. The personal cost to aircrew members extended beyond those killed or missing in action. Morrison himself sustained injuries during a mission on December 7, 1943, when anti-aircraft fire damaged his aircraft's hydraulic systems and wounded his gunner. He successfully returned to base despite partial loss of flight controls, receiving commendation for his airmanship under emergency conditions. His gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, underwent surgery for shrapnel wounds and returned to flying status 6 weeks later. Both men completed their combat tours and returned to the United States, surviving experiences that claimed many of their squadron mates. German records from units that opposed 9th Air Force tactical operations provide complementary perspectives on the effectiveness of A-20 attacks. After-action reports from Wehrmacht ground units frequently cite air attacks as significant factors affecting operational capabilities. A report from a panzer division retreating through France in August 1944 described how sustained attacks by American light bombers, almost certainly including A-20s, destroyed numerous vehicles, disrupted movement schedules, and forced defensive dispositions that slowed the unit's withdrawal. The report's author noted that losses to air attack exceeded losses from ground combat during the withdrawal period. Luftwaffe fighter pilot accounts from the same period reveal frustration at their inability to effectively protect ground forces from tactical air attack. Fuel shortages limited combat air patrol operations. Allied fighter escorts made interception attempts extremely hazardous. Even when fighter units successfully engaged bomber formations, the sustained defensive and offensive firepower of aircraft like the A-20G made successful attacks costly. One Luftwaffe fighter pilot, whose memoir appeared in a 1957 German aviation magazine, described his squadron's declining effectiveness during summer 1944 as fuel became scarce, experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements arrived, and every mission meant confronting overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The strategic bombing campaign against German industrial centers received extensive historical attention and analysis, but tactical air operations like those conducted by A-20 units contributed substantially to Allied victory through cumulative effects that degraded German military capability across multiple dimensions. Transportation interdiction complicated logistics. Attacks on parked aircraft reduced Luftwaffe operational strength. Suppression of defensive positions during ground operations saved Allied lives. The psychological burden on German ground forces facing continuous air attack without effective friendly air support eroded morale and combat effectiveness. The Douglas A-20 Havoc concluded its combat service with an operational record that validated the tactical innovations developed through combat experience in multiple theaters. Total production exceeded 7,600 aircraft across all variants, making it one of the most numerous American light bombers of World War II. Soviet forces operated more A-20s than any other air force, with over 3,000 aircraft delivered through Lend-Lease arrangements. British Commonwealth forces, Free French units, and various Allied air forces also flew the type in combat roles, ranging from night intruder missions to tactical bombing and ground attack. Post-war analysis of the A-20's effectiveness in the gunship configuration influenced subsequent tactical aircraft development. The concept of concentrated forward-firing armament optimized for ground attack missions reappeared in later aircraft designs, including the Douglas A-26 Invader, which succeeded the A-20 in American service and featured even heavier forward armament. Korean War operations validated these design principles when A-26 units achieved devastating effectiveness against ground targets using tactics developed during World War II with A-20 gunships. The psychological dimension of the German fighter pilot experience when first encountering A-20G variants represented a microcosm of broader patterns that characterized Luftwaffe operations during the war's final years. Initial confidence based on previous combat experience and intelligence assessments gave way to recognition that Allied tactical and technological innovation had created new threats, requiring modified defensive responses. The institutional flexibility that allowed American forces to rapidly implement field modifications and translate successful innovations into factory production standards contrasted with more rigid German procurement processes that struggled to adapt quickly to changing operational requirements. Oberleutnant Klaus Mertens survived his forced landing on March 21, 1943, and returned to operational flying after his damaged aircraft underwent repairs. He flew combat missions through the remainder of 1943 and into early 1944 before his unit received transfer orders to the Eastern Front. Mertens was killed in action on June 17, 1944, during air combat over Byelarussia. Soviet records indicate his aircraft was shot down during a ground attack mission, though specific circumstances remain unclear. He was 26 years old. The 341st Bombardment Group continued operations through the final months of the European War, supporting Allied ground forces during the advance into Germany. The group flew its final combat mission on April 25, 1945, against German positions in Austria. During 24 months of combat operations, the group's crews flew over 11,000 sorties, delivered thousands of tons of ordnance, and claimed destruction of hundreds of locomotives, vehicles, aircraft, and military installations. The group lost 163 aircraft to all causes during this period, with over 400 aircrew members killed, missing, or captured. The legacy of the A-20 in its gunship configuration extends beyond its immediate combat effectiveness to represent broader principles about military innovation and adaptation. The willingness to fundamentally modify operational aircraft based on combat experience, the speed with which field modifications influenced factory production, and the tactical flexibility that allowed rapid exploitation of new capabilities all contributed to Allied success. These institutional characteristics, as much as specific technical achievements, created decisive advantages that German forces increasingly could not match as the war progressed. The story that began with Klaus Mertens diving toward what he assumed was a vulnerable light bomber ended with recognition that American tactical aviation had evolved beyond existing German intelligence assessments and tactical doctrine. The 650 caliber machine guns that erupted from the A-20's nose section on that March morning over Holland represented not just a specific technical modification, but a broader pattern of innovation, adaptation, and industrial capacity that ultimately proved decisive. The mockery that some German pilots initially directed toward the A-20 gave way to respect for an aircraft that had been transformed from conventional bomber to formidable ground attack weapon through combat-driven innovation and systematic implementation. The lessons learned came at substantial cost for both sides. Allied aircrew members who flew A-20 combat missions faced continuous danger from anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, weather, and enemy fighters. German ground forces and fighter pilots who opposed these operations paid equally high prices as tactical air superiority translated into battlefield advantage. The technological and tactical evolution, represented by the A-20's gunship configuration, contributed to Allied victory through cumulative effects that, while perhaps less dramatic than strategic bombing campaigns or major ground battles, nonetheless materially affected the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.